Two very different primaries are unfolding right now in the 1st Congressional District. On the Democratic side, there's a clear frontrunner. The Republican race is more of a scrum right now, and the longer that persists, the more likely it is that the primary could be up for grabs for the candidate that best captures the interest of the GOP base. One of the candidates currently in position to make that play joins us this morning in studio. Hollie Noveletsky, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So I feel like maybe you've surprised some of the other people in this race with your staying power, being at the top of the latest polls, but how are you going to hang in there when that eventual barrage of advertising likely comes from Mr. Anthony DiLorenzo?
Well, so I really have a strong grassroots support, and I think that's really important. I speak to the grassroots about fighting for the American worker and fighting for American manufacturing, and that is resonating. And when I speak to the individuals, and I'm out every night, you have to do that in New Hampshire, right? Eye to eye. The authenticity is real, and the fact that I understand because I've been fighting for them for 25 years, and they hear that. And so that's resonating really strongly. And I think that's going to continue to go. You can't buy an election in New Hampshire. People want to have their voice heard, and they want to know what you have to say. And it's all about meeting them face to face, and I'm willing to do that and put that effort out.
Is support for Trump administration policies going to be an issue in this race, do you think?
You know, I stand with President Trump on a lot of his issues, especially immigration. I think that his policies are strong. Some people don't care for the personality, but they like the policies. So I think it's going to be all about the individual and how they interpret that.
And you were critical recently of DiLorenzo over when he was saying that he didn't agree with President Trump on, pressuring the Fed and wanting to change out the leader of the Fed. On the policy side of things, though, why do you think it's a good idea to allow more sort of a political influence in that office?
Well, it's not, ideally, it's supposed to be completely independent. But Powell obviously has shown that he was not independent. He manipulated, or he lowered the interest rates just before Kamala was going to be elected. Hopefully he hoped. But then after President Trump was elected, he slow-walked it. So he showed that he had a bias in it. So that was the criticism, that President Trump had the right to call that out. That's really where the difference was. But I think it's important in this primary to call out the differences between myself and say Anthony, because we do have very strong different political perspectives. We may both be Republicans, but we see things differently.
And that's certainly on the issues. That's one of them. Let's talk about Merrimack right now and the proposed ICE facility there. If you're in Congress right now representing the 1st District, how are you handling this situation?
So Merrimack is a state issue, but we the people of the United States, have voted for deportation and immigration. Overwhelmingly, President Trump was elected to take care of the immigration issue, the illegal immigration that happened under President Biden. And I think people really wanted to see it done, but they were expecting a little bit more of a sanitized version. And if we allow our judicial system, our correctional system, our police to work hand in hand with ICE, we will have a much more orderly deportation of the illegal immigrants, especially the ones who have broken the law. We're not going to have what we had in Minnesota, and we're doing it really right here in New Hampshire. We have, I think it's 13 cities and towns right now who have a relationship with ICE that can make that transition, that orderly handoff, much smoother, and we'll be doing it well. We do have the prisons up in Berlin and some of the jails, the county jails, who are holding deportation individuals who are cited for deportation. We need to be able to do that. And the fact that we want to put a deportation for processing, that'll be a state issue. I think the communication was really what broke down here.
Yeah, you mentioned, the idea that people expected something more sanitized. They did vote for this policy.
Yes, they did.
But maybe they didn't want it to be so in your face.
Right.
So, you have Republicans in Merrimack who are saying, we don't want this here. If you were in Congress, though, why wouldn't you try to help them?
It's not that I wouldn't try to help them. I think it's the issue of having their voice heard and opening communication. There seems to have been a breakdown in communication between the federal and the state, and that's what I think has hurt this whole process, because the communication was somewhat muddled, and the governor is taking care of that.
Do you think the governor should be on the same page with the president in supporting this facility?
I think the governor needs to take care of both the federal and the state and be the the critical link in helping to discuss and make sure that both needs are met. We do want to take care of the illegal immigrants. People of New Hampshire should feel safe in their communities. We should not have to worry about sending our 12-year-old child to the local store and having what happened to Jocelyn Nunbergery. We should be able to have women go out jogging and not have them happen to Rachel Morin. We need to take care of our community, and the only way to do that is really to address the illegal criminals that are here. And they were not vetted. We need to make sure that they are deported.
One more question on this issue of how the tactics are being handled. I think, most people who support the idea of religious liberty believe that it's a human right and not just one that is assigned to citizens. Should ICE be targeting churches and areas around churches? And, before anyone says, hey, that's not happening, we've seen Cardinal Dolan in New York City saying that ICE is being too aggressive around his parishes, specifically in New York, in rounding up immigrants for deportation. So is that appropriate to target houses of worship?
So New York is a sanctuary city, and they are really hindering the ability for ICE to do their work. If New York and other blue sanctuary states allowed ICE to communicate with the police, like I said, with the law enforcement, with the judicial system, with the prison systems, they wouldn't have this issue. They are setting that in place by hindering ICE's ability to get these people who are doing bad things in our community, who have been arrested and have been prosecuted, or at least arrested and charged, put it that way, and then released. So they're setting this up.
Should churches be off limits, though?
I don't believe that they're really going into the churches, but they're around churches.
If you're the nominee up against Stephanie Shaheen, potentially on the Democratic side there, is her work for Dean Kamen going to be an issue in this race in regards to how things have unfolded with the Epstein files? Obviously, he's named in those and has had a relationship of some kind with the convicted trafficker, Jeffrey Epstein. Well,
from my understanding, she's been on the board for quite a while. She will have to address that. She will have to address that. And the Democrats have been crying, we haven't released the Epstein files. We've released them all. Why didn't they do it under Biden? That's the issue. But people who have been associated with them may need to address that. She did get off the board, but only after it came out. So what she knows, we have to find out. So
I think some would take issue that all files had been released. I think that their claim is that they're not. But, other countries are taking action. We see Prince Andrew being arrested. It doesn't look like any big names are being protected overseas right now. Why don't we see something similar going on in the United States? Shouldn't the Trump administration be going after some of the people who are named here?
I think they will be, but it takes time. The documents have been released, and they're going to have to do their due diligence.
The Save America Act. Let's get to this real quick. Explain why you think this is a good idea, because in the past, Republicans have said, hey, don't touch our statewide election system. We handle it well here. Why do you think this would work? I
think the fact that we need to prove citizenship, because we don't want to dilute the citizens' vote and voice. And we need to make sure that it is only people who are appropriate, people who are citizens voting in our elections. And to prove citizenship is not that big of an issue. People say, oh, you can't, if a woman changes her name, she got married. I changed my license once I got married. So it's not a big issue, but we need to make sure that our elections are safe and secure, and the integrity is in place, and I think that's really important.
Shouldn't the system help those women, though? I mean, who maybe lose their documents, right? It would be a shame if a citizen was not able to vote based simply on a maiden name issue, right?
What do you mean lose their documents? I mean
everybody loses papers, things like that.
I know, and you can just call up to this town or the state.
But should the federal government be helping to facilitate that, though, right? Because in the law change.
I believe there is a form out now that you can help register to vote. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hollie Noveletsky, thanks for joining us on Close Up. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
See you out there on the